My Side of the Mountain, page 131, in which I have a good look at winter and find spring in the snow. With Christmas over, the winter became serious. The snows deepened, the wind blew, the temperatures dropped until the air snapped and talked. Never had humanity seemed so far away as it did in those cold, still months of January, February, and March. I wandered the snowy crags, listened to the language of birds by day and to the noises of the weather by night. The wind howled, the snow avalanched, and the air creaked. I slept, ate, played my reed whistle, and talked to Frightful. To be relaxed, warm, and part of the winter wilderness is an unforgettable experience. I was in excellent condition, not a cold, not a sniffle, not a moment of fatigue. I enjoyed the feeling that I could eat, sleep, and be warm and outwit the storms that blasted the mountains and the sub-zero temperatures that numbed them. Please follow along. It snowed on. I plowed through drifts and stamped paths until eventually it occurred to me that I had all the materials to make snowshoes for easier traveling. Here are the snowshoe notes. I made slats out of ash saplings, which is, a sapling is a small tree, an ash tree. Whittling them thin enough to bow, I soaked them in water to make them bend more easily, looped the two ends together, and wound them with hide. With my penknife, I made holes an inch apart all around the loop. I strung deer hide crisscross through the loops. I made a loop of hide to hold my toe and straps to tie the shoes on. When I first walked in these shoes, I tripped on my toes and fell, but by the end of the first day, I could walk from the tree to the gorge in half the time. I live close to the weather. It is surprising how you watch it when you live in it. Not a cloud passes unnoticed, not a wind blew untested. I knew the moods of the storms, where they came from, their shapes and their colors. When the sun shone, I took Frightful to the meadow and we slid down the mountain on my snapping turtle shell sled. She really didn't care much for this. When the winds changed and the air smelled like snow, I would stay in my tree because I had gotten lost in a blizzard one afternoon and had to hole up in a rock ledge until I could see where I was going. That day the winds were so strong I could not push against them, so I crawled under the ledge. For hours I wondered if I would be able to dig myself out when the storm blew on. Fortunately, I only had to push through about a foot of snow. However, that taught me to stay home when the air said snow. Not that I was afraid of being caught far from home in a storm, for I could find food and shelter and make a fire anywhere, but I had become as attached to my hemlock house as a brooding bird to her nest. Caught out in the storms and weather, I had an urgent desire to return to my tree, even as the bear and weasel returned to his den and the deer to their copse. We all had our little patch in the wilderness. We all fought to return there. I usually come home at night with the nuthatch that roosted in a nearby sapling. I knew if I was late, if I tapped the tree and he came out. Sometimes, when the weather was icy and miserable, I would hear him high in the tree near the edge of the meadow, yanking and yanking and flicking his tail, and then I would see him wing to bed early. I considered him a pretty good barometer, and if he went into his tree early, I went to mine early too. So again, he's watching the birds. He's doing what they're doing because they have a good sense of the weather. When you don't have a newspaper or a radio to give you weather bulletins, watch the birds and animals. They can tell you when a storm is coming. I called the nuthatch barometer, and when he holed up, I holed up, lit my light, and sat by my fire whittling or learning new tunes on my reed whistle. I was now really into the teeth of winter and quite fascinated by its activity. There is no such thing as a still winter night. Not only are many animals running around in the creaking cold, but the trees cry out and the limbs snap and fall and the winds get caught in a ravine and screams until it dies. One noisy night, I put this down. There's somebody in my bedroom. I can hear small exchanges of greetings and little feet moving up the wall. By the time I get to my light, all is quiet. What do you think that is?
Raccoon.
It's, no, tiny mice, the mice. Next day, there was something in my room last night. A small tunnel leads out from my door into the snow. It is a marvelous tunnel, neatly packed, and it goes from a dried fern to a clump of moss. Then it turns and disappears. I would say mouse. That night, I kept an ember glowing and I got a little light fast before the visitor could get out the door. It was a mouse. A perfect little white-footed deer mouse with enormous black eyes and tidy white feet. Caught in the act of intruding, he decided not to retreat, but he came toward me a few steps. I handed him a nut meat. He took it with his fragile paws, stuffed it in his cheek, flipped, and went out his secret tunnel. Isn't that funny? The little mouse just came right up to him and took the nut. No doubt the tunnel leads right over to my store tree, and this fellow is having a fat winter, stealing his food. There were no raccoons or skunks about in the snow, but the mice, the weasels, the mink, the foxes, the shrews, the cottontail rabbits were all busier than Coney Island in July. Their tracks were all over the mountain, and their activities ranged from catching each other to hauling various materials back to their dens and burrows for more insulation. By day, the birds were a wing. They got up late after I did, and they would call to each other before hunting. I would stir up my fire and think about how much food it must take to keep one little bird alive in that fierce cold. They must eat and eat, I thought. Once, however, I came upon a male cardinal sitting in a hawthorn bush. It was a miserable day, gray, damp, and somewhere around the 0 mark. The cardinal wasn't doing anything at all, just sitting on a twig, all fluffed up to keep himself warm. Now there's a wise bird, I said to myself. He's conserving his energy. None of this flying around looking for food and wasting effort. As I watched him, he shifted his feet twice, standing on one and pulling the other up to warm it in his feathers. Isn't that funny how the bird stands on one foot, warms it, then switches and does the other one? I had often wondered why birds' feet didn't freeze, and there was my answer. He even sat down on both of them and let his warm feathers cover them like socks. January 8th. I took Frightful out today. We went over to the meadow to catch a rabbit for her. As we passed one of the hemlocks near the edge of the grove, she pulled her feathers to her body and looked alarmed. I tried to find out what had frightened her, but saw nothing. On the way back, we passed the same tree, and I noticed an owl pellet cast in the snow. I looked up. There were lots of limbs and darkness, but I could not see the owl. I walked around the tree. Frightful stared at one spot until I thought her head would swivel off. I looked, and there it was, looking like a broken limb, a great horned owl. I must say, I was excited to have such a neighbor. I hit the tree with a stick and he flew off. Those great wings, they must have been 5 feet across. Beat the wind, but there was no sound. The owl steered down the mountain through the tree limbs, and somewhere, not far away, he vanished in the needles and limbs. It is really very special to have a horned owl. I guess I feel this way because he is such a wilderness bird. He needs lots of forest and big trees, and so his presence means that the Gribbly farm is a beautiful place indeed. One week, the weather gave a little to the sun, and snow melted, and limbs dumped their loads and popped up into the air. I thought I'd try to make an igloo. I was cutting big blocks of snow and putting them in a circle. Frightful was dozing with her face in the sun, and the tree sparrows were raiding the hemlock cones. I worked and hummed and did not notice the gray sheet of cloud that was sneaking up the mountains from the northwest. It covered the sun, suddenly. I realized the air was damp enough to ring. I could stay warm as a bug if I didn't get wet. So I looked at the drab mess in the sky, whistled for Frightful, and started back to the tree. We holed up just as Barometer was yanking his way home. And it was none too soon. It drizzled, it misted, it sprinkled, and it finally froze. The deer hide door grew stiff with ice as darkness came, and it rattled like a piece of tin when the wind hit it. I made a fire, the tree room warmed, and I sputtered around with a concoction I call possum sop, a meal of frozen possum stewed with lichen, snakeweed, and lousewort. It is a different sort of dish, of course. What I really like about it are the names of all the plants with the name possum. I fooled for an hour or so brewing this dish, adding this and that. When I heard the mouse in his tunnel, I realized he was making an awful fuss and decided it was because he was trying to gnaw through ice to get in. I decided to help him. Frightful was on her post, and I wanted to see the mouse's face when he found out he was in a den with a falcon. That's not good for the mouse, is it? I pushed the deerskin door. It wouldn't budge. I kicked it. It gave a little, cracking like china, and I realized that I was going to be iced in if I didn't keep that door open.